Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another session of EI Live K-12 for students and educators. My name is Cassie, and I oversee education and outreach activities at the Earth Institute. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Earth Institute, our core mission is to foster a greater understanding of the science behind the climate crisis and sustainability, and what we as global citizens can do. Experts that make up the Earth Institute include experts from include economists, business and policy experts, specialists in public health and law, and earth and environmental sciences. So it's a very interdisciplinary institute made up of more than 24 or so research centers and several hundred people who collaborate across Columbia University. So what we're hoping to do with these EI Live K-12 sessions is to introduce you to that wonderful interdisciplinary work through our experts. We're going to run sessions weekly until the end of June. And if you have any questions about the rest of the schedule, please do not hesitate to contact me. We also have a very special session happening on Earth Day on Thursday from 4 to 4:45 p.m. as well, Eastern Standard Time. So let me know if you would like to learn more about those upcoming sessions. So today we're very lucky to have Josh DeVincenzo from the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, which is one of the largest centers as part of the Earth Institute, where he's a senior instructional designer. And he's going to be talking to us about communicating climate and climate change being a very difficult issue to talk about and to discuss. And so what are some of the communication techniques that we might use when we talk about climate? So Josh will do his presentation, and we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes towards the end of the session for questions. If you do have questions that come up during the session, please type it into the Q&A box, which is where we're going to be monitoring everything. We'll be sure to get to to all of the questions. And without further ado, Josh, if you want to take over and get started, thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Cassie. Start a timer because I want to be respectful of everybody's time here. And then I'm going to hide the meeting controls here. Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Josh DeVincenzo, and thanks for the introduction, Cassie. I look forward to the K-12 series each year that we're doing it. So it's really exciting to be here to be talking about what we talk about when we talk about climate. And what you'll see is it's not so simple as we might think, and there's many learning curves. At the outset, this is really designed for students from grades 6 to 12. So I'm going to try my best to make it as accessible as possible and explain concepts down to really its root so we can kind of share in the understanding. If you're here live, I appreciate you being here. And I know these videos are often very useful kind of in the future and looking at the recording. So if you're watching this at another point in time, thank you for engaging in the conversation about climate. So I do have a couple aims today, and one of them is something that we don't usually include in our conversations around climate change, and that is the thinking skills, or how we process information about climate change, and why it's so important that we focus on thinking skills and not necessarily assume that everybody's at the same baseline knowledge or understands the same way around the complex things, the complex components of climate change. So we'll also talk about why it's so complicated and some ways that we can mitigate or make it a little bit less complicated for folks. And then finally, we'll be looking at some strategies for engaging in discussion. And any of these strategies that we talk about, you can also do at the individual level and kind of think about it in that way in terms of reflection. And we'll see reflecting is incredibly important when kind of up against the magnitude of the climate crisis. And of course, we want to keep some time for questions and answers. So again, and thank you to all the students for this past year and continuing to learn, being with us here on Monday afternoon. I'm sure that you might have already been on Zoom calls, and to the educators for all your work this past year. So ways to engage, I understand it might be your last meeting of the day, or it might be your last class session, learning component of the day. So a couple ways to engage if you want to kind of interact with the presentation, no pressure. If you're kind of want to just sit back and listen to the presentation, that is totally cool as well. But a couple ways to do this. Here is a QR code for a Padlet. We're going to be talking about different ways to design how we think about things. And one of those ways is called a mind map. You could also kind of do it just in your notebook. So what comes to mind? List as many things as you can about climate change. And we'll see that this list, if you hear something in the presentation that resonates or something that comes to mind after we look at some different images, feel free to put that on the climate change mind map. is really unique because usually these climate change mind maps are never the same. People are incorporating so many different vantage points into how they perceive climate change. So the bit.ly link too, if you want to go from your computer, it's bit.ly /2RO capitalized, and then SILK. And feel free to add things while we go and go from there. So just a couple of different ways to engage with the presentation. We're doing our best to make the Zoom environment as interactive as possible with this information, especially if it's new. So getting situated for today's discussion. So we're talking about a couple different things here. We're talking about climate change, which we understand to be just a really complex system of many moving components. And then we're also going to be talking about our individual biographies. And what we mean by that, it's really your story. So the people you engage with, your understanding, the events, those memories, everything that goes kind of into your personal biography. Oftentimes we're looking at these things separated from each other. So we're looking at climate change under usually a scientific lens, trying to understand the phenomena. And then we look at our individual biographies as potentially things that are different from that. But what we want to do today is really look at what happens when those two gears come together. And we're looking at the relationship between climate change and our individual stories, because we'll see what this does is actually opens up the discussion to more than people that are climate scientists, for example, or are looking at this in a different lens. We can see that we're actually all really embedded into these conversations. It's just a matter of how we discuss it. And we'll be talking about those thinking skills to open that field of discussion. What we talk about when we talk about climate change really first starts with how we think about climate change, and then ultimately how we learn about climate. And we'll see here that we're all really learning in real time together. And that aspect of doing this together also just opens our opportunity to learn. So there's really no silly questions when it comes to climate. Even asking what is climate change is a fantastic question. And we will share just a definition for today's discussion, but we'll see that there's going to be that climate change gear definition, but the way that we've experienced it, the individual biography, that definition might be different and unique to us. So very first and foremost, are we talking about it? The Yale program on climate communications is one of like the most popular ways to gauge climate change in the American mind, for example, and really looking here at what goes on in terms of are people discussing it in their households? Are they discussing it in the media? And you can see this is taking us from 2008 all the way to 2020. And this kind of shed some light on what we call an expert blind spot, where because we're engaged, for example, at the Earth Institute in conversations around climate every day, we can't assume that everybody else is also doing that with that same level of energy. So this, to me, signals what can we do to increase these numbers? You see, it's been pretty steady. The media coverage in 2020 did take a dip, but as everybody knows, we had plenty to talk about in 2020. So that's some of the explanations, but our assumption might have been, for example, when we talk about climate with the energy that we do, that these numbers are up more in the 75% range, where in actuality, we're still hovering around the 30% here. So in actuality, we do need to be discussing it more, but are we equipping people with the skills to articulate what they're feeling around climate, apart from strictly statistical information? And this brings us to this really interesting way to look at this, though, a theater of knowing. This really goes to show the relationship between those two gears. So everything that's happening in our external environment or outside, and these could be different theories, these can be pictures that we see on our phones, in the newspaper, whatever it might be, on television. These are concepts, feelings, descriptions. So a lot of what makes sense in our biographies, but are happening outside. And then via reflection, this bridge on the top here is where we begin to think, how are we thinking about it on the inside? And being able to look at both of these things is incredibly important, and thinking about the image a little bit deeper and looking at it and asking questions. We'll see how important asking questions about what's going on truly is to what we talk about when we talk about climate change. But I do want to focus, before moving to the next slide, on what's going on inside that internal processing. So you can see here emotions. We'll talk about analogies, narratives, metaphors. Those connections to the images of what we're experiencing all create where this learning happens, and how we are going to be able to conceptualize climate change for this broader system. And we'll focus a lot on the systems thinking approach to climate change towards the end here. And this is a great example, just fresh off the presses. Right before our meeting today, I was on my phone and looking through Twitter, and I saw from the New York Times just today, this is an excellent example of how everything on the external side of the theater of knowing impacts how we process it on the internal side of the theater of knowing. So for folks that are familiar with New York or are based in New York or have seen this in the news, we did have a climate clock project that is going on, and it was started out initially as a countdown clock of how much time we have to reduce our emissions, and it was suspenseful, and you can see that the suspense has an effect on the internal processes in the theater of knowing. But you can see today, you can see they did take a different strategy of the climate clock. That now it's estimating, it's going to still do the countdown clock because there is some value to that urgency, but they have shifted a little bit to more of an optimistic message around renewable energies and the percentage of energy that is being used as a renewable resource. Which is excellent. It's a different message, and we can see how our messaging and how we frame our conversations around climate are going to really decide in many ways how we're going to engage with it. Are we avoiding the topic? Can we stay on more of the optimistic note with still paying attention to the very seriousness of the matter that causes urgency? But we know a lot from the cognitive science or the science of how we think and feel about things, that those will always inspire different reactions. So this is just one example about the theater of knowing and how our messaging is very important here. So with that said, there's different kinds of learning. So you might be thinking learning has to happen in a classroom, it has to happen in a notebook, but learning is really happening all the time. And we've really tried to classify different ways that learning occurs. So there's one that, and both are very important. There's no kind of hierarchy of what's the better learning approach, but they're just different. So instrumental learning really involves predictions about observable things. So we often call this declarative knowing. This is what we can state for a fact. For example, the city capitals, the capital cities in the United States would be an example of instrumental learning. Whereas today we want to introduce this new aspect of communicative learning, which is a way of learning that's very distinct from instrumental, because the purpose of learning here is, what do others mean? And how do we make ourselves understood as we share ideas through speech, written word, plays, film, TV, art, and so on, especially when it comes to our conversations around climate. So learning from each other, and then also making sense in that internal theater of knowing. So just a key definition, I've already said climate change and a couple times here at least, and without defining it. And this is where we also find a lot of the kind of lapse in conversations around climate change, is because we don't necessarily pause to define it and look at it for all of its component parts, which we'll do later in the session. But for today's discussion, I don't want to make any assumptions of what people know about climate change. So I do want to just use this definition to root us, and then we'll begin to look a little bit into more of the individual biographies, definitions of climate change. But this is a very popular quote. You'll see it a lot in the instrumental content when we're going through articles, whatever it might be. And I'm sure people might have already seen this definition, but I do want to focus on the bottom part here. A change of climate, which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to the natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. So that's the technical definition of climate change that we'll use for today. I only want to include one literature slide because it's very important. And it's really important because this is kind of my way of understanding climate change through academic literature. And we'll see that other people will have different ways as well. But climate change and why it's so complex is because it belongs to this very rare category of situations where it's extraordinarily difficult to put meaningful bounds to the extent of possible planetary damages. So what that's saying is it's a rare category where we can't necessarily pinpoint or we don't do it well at this point of causality. And that's something that happens when we look at this from the systems, where we're going to be able to connect and make those connections of causality and looking at climate change as this interactive aspect of so many different components. Ultimately, the threat from climate change will require strategies to both reduce the threat and mitigate the consequences. This is saying that the current efforts is going to require us to change the way we live, the way we do business, and the way we engage in societal development, and the way that we talk, essentially, which is the focus of today's presentation. Just one more, and then I'll move on here away from the literature, but it's always important to pay homage to the literature that creates some of these thoughts here. But no climate scientist would suggest that a climate system has been fully described and understood. It is, however, known at a sufficient level to say how human activity can influence the climate. So really focusing on that human aspect and our role in this broader system. And then this last one is really talking about, it's not necessarily a deficit of knowledge per se, because we can really do everything in our power to make sure that instrumental knowledge gets out there, but it requires different understandings. It needs an educational process of not solely adding to knowledge, but also inducing conceptual change. And we'll see that conceptual change isn't always accomplished by just empirical evidence, and really how we talk about these things on that personal level. So some common questions that always come up are, why is it so difficult to understand? What do I need to know? And what can I do? And we're going to look at some of that just ahead here. It really comes back to complexity, and it's that complexity of that theater of knowledge. It happens at the individual level, but then it also happens in that social level. So the complexity is the relationship between these complex demands, or what the world requires of us, and through the events, through the changing climate, and comparing that to our mental complexity of how we're processing these things. What connections are we making? Are we pausing to actually make those connections? Another way to look at it, and what we see is a really important tactic when discussing climate, is giving people different options, different examples of ways to look at this, because it is so complex. This is an equation very popular from Kurt Lewin, which is basically stating behavior is a function of a person and their environment. He wasn't necessarily talking about the ecological environment when he wrote this, but it's really that exchange, that interplay, or how those two things relate, person and environment. And we see that's so important when we look at climate. Lastly, when we think about cognition, it's also really important to know that it's distributed. And what we mean by distributed is it's shared. We need people to be doing different functions and to really create a comprehensive knowledge base. So human cognition is always going to be situated in this complex social cultural world and cannot be unaffected by that. And what sociocultural is talking about is really the norms, the values, how we get along as a society, what are kind of the rules of thumb, and how that affects our cognition. And cognition is really that fancy way of looking at how we think about things and how we think about climate. So cognition is socially distributed, meaning it's more than just one individual's knowledge structure. It's this boat metaphor, this boat analogy, where people are doing different functions and we need them to be doing so for the good of that collective cognition here, or the social cognition. The key point here, and what I really want to drive home, and we will continue to look at strategies in 1 second here, but the key point is, when we talk about climate change, it's allowed to be personal. And I think this is something that we often overlook, is that we think about climate change strictly in the instrumental, the scientific information, which is incredibly valuable, but there is a step that we do need to look into, is the personal aspects of how we're engaging with the climate. So it's allowed to be personal. We can have conversations that are not solely focused on CO2 emissions. We can talk about other things, and we're going to look at ways to begin that conversation here. So one strategy, and we're going to go through a couple strategies here that you can use in your classrooms, with your friends, your family, to begin talking about climate change. And the first is very straightforward. It's telling a story. So what's our relationship with the planet? One quick vignette here would be, I remember as a kid, my father was my baseball coach in t-ball. And I remember one game I was especially excited to play. I don't know if my close friend was on the other team or what it was, but I wanted to play that day. And essentially, we unfortunately encountered heavy rain. And eventually the game actually got rained out. And my dad was the coach. He called the shots. He called who played, etc., the roster. So I, as a young kid, assumed he also controlled the weather. And I remember having, as a little kid, a breakdown around the game being canceled. And I remember my father saying distinctly, "Josh, I can't control the weather. I can't control the weather." And for me, that was news. That was just news. So what goes into the weather? What goes into the rain? Why is this baseball game canceled? And so on. And that really brought about many questions that I would have, but also a fond memory to look at my own relationship with the planet. The other one would be, especially this week of all weeks, going into Earth Day and Earth Week. What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. A beautiful song if you haven't heard it. But for me, growing up, that characterized our Earth Day or our Earth Week, was constantly hearing Louis Armstrong's song and listening to the lyrics and looking at all the different components of life. It was just extraordinarily beneficial. And then here on the very end is just describing what it means once we transition and begin to think about our relationship with the planet. So often we fall into the ego side here, where it's this hierarchy where we might be above things in the planet. Whereas by reflecting on these stories, seeing that we can all really have these climate dialogues, these climate stories, or just that moment we started paying attention to, oh, my dad doesn't control the weather, we can begin moving into more of the eco and looking how we coexist here. So that's one way, just to tell stories here. Another would be to look for analogies. So a popular analogy when talking about climate is as looking at the relationship between climate and weather. So one analogy to that allows a lot of people to just understand almost automatically the differences would be weather is like your mood, and your mood varies each day. So maybe I'm hoping everybody woke up, had an excellent Monday, so you're in a great mood today, but you might not necessarily be in that great mood every day. Whereas climate is like your personality or the summation or all your moods combined over the course of the years, and it's created a temperament and how you're perceived or how you feel and your personality. But be careful, always check for accuracy. The analogies are really useful, but sometimes it can overstep or oversimplify. So always check for accuracy. One example of that is when we look at the common adage of the 100-year flood. We spend a lot of time debunking the 100-year flood. Whereas folks might think that a 100-year flood will only occur once every 100 years, and not necessarily that it's really talking about a probability on an annual basis of 1 out of 100 each year. And that really changes the picture here. So be careful, always fact check, but at the same time, the analogies can be incredibly useful to just at least frame it in a way that you're trying to engage somebody with a conversation piece around climate. Another strategy, and really the focus really here, is going to be thinking in systems. And this is something that I am incredibly big on in terms of changing how we think about climate and moving towards more of the systems approach. One way to do that and to actually interact with that is the concept map. So doing a concept map of your understanding and then seeking answers to the gaps. So if there's something that you want to learn more about, or you see your concept map is ending at a certain area, that could be a great opportunity to have a conversation with your teacher of, hey, I would really like to learn a lot more about the social science of climate change and what goes on in that area of the system. So systems thinking is thinking of the world as interrelated network of dynamic entities linked by functional relations. A very technical way to say things are linked together. Think of it as kind of like a domino. So one domino falls, everything in the line will also fall. And that's essentially what we're looking at with systems. Instead of just looking at climate change and stopping at that level, we need to ask a lot of questions to get to the different system aspects or the different system components. So once this relationship between structure and behavior is established, we can understand how these systems truly work together and how to shift it into better behaviors, which is essentially at the core of how important this is to do with the climate crisis. And then we must routinely revisit our models and update. So going back to our systems, extending the logic, extending what we're thinking about, and then also always validating. So if you want to kind of create a concept map and bring it to your science teacher, for example, if you're looking at strictly the global warming, you can bring it to them and ask them for some feedback. Feedback is going to be incredibly important here. So concept maps is really going to help us delineate knowing what, so that declarative, versus knowing how. So knowing why things occur, how things occur. So concept maps, again, are an excellent tool to get started with representing what you think about things, your knowledge, and then also having conversation with your peers. You can take time, like 5 minutes each, just writing out your own concept map and then comparing and having a conversation about why you think that way, or what it is that you'd like to see more, or why you added that component. Because what you'll see with these concept maps, they tend to be very unique person to person. And then we are able to really form these small scale models of external reality. So in our theater of knowing, thinking things through, and then making sense of our outside, our external world through various alternatives. So this is another nudge over to our class or group mental model over there, the QR code and the bit.ly link. And you can see that when we list what comes to mind at climate change, for me, it's T-ball, it's Louis Armstrong's trumpet, it's things like that. And going back to eventually bridging to the logic of climate science. And we're going to talk about how to get to that point in the next slide here. These are actually two just quick examples of getting started, and getting started where you're comfortable, where you're at in your learning journey. So climate change here, and then just adding a couple different branches, and then eventually through time and through the more exposure you have to the different components of climate change, branching it out into something else, trying to connect dots, trying to do if then. So if this happens, then this happens, and mapping out all these interrelated parts So really moving from knowing what to the moving how. One way to do that, because I get this a lot, is, Josh, how do I get started with a mental map, concept map? There's a couple different ways, and we're going to look at two quick ways to do that with ladders. So one is the ladder of inference here, which talks about why we do tend to have very different understandings around climate change. So at the bottom here, you have reality and facts. You have really a lot of where that instrumental type learning lives. And then you have what gets really complicated for folks that are focused on cognitive science is what happens next when we go up this ladder. So we look at the selective reality, or what we're picking and choosing for our mental models, or what we're putting on our mental our mental and conceptual map. The interpreted reality, our assumptions, our conclusions, our beliefs, and how that eventually becomes the actions that we take together. So if someone you're speaking to, for example, has very strong opinions opposed to climate, really trying to locate where they are on this ladder of inference and working from there is always a key strategy, because you'll see people are in very distinct places in their climate journey and in their understanding, and we're all continuously learning together, which makes it a little bit more complicated. There's no this ladder goes on and on, is what I'm trying to say here. And then when you want to get started with your concept maps, but you're not necessarily sure how, and you're having trouble just listing off different components of climate change, it really comes back to our questioning strategy. So what are the questions we're asking? So you can see here, this is called a ladders of abstraction. It's a method used to take something very abstract and break it down into its parts, and then vice versa. So up at the top is where climate change, unfortunately, usually lives. It lives at this abstraction component, and we never, I shouldn't say we never, but it oftentimes, for sake of time, for sake of distractions, for sake of limitations, whatever it might be, we usually don't go down the ladder in climate change. And what we need to begin doing through our conversations, through our communicative learning, is beginning to go up and down that ladder. So one quick example, because eventually what you want to do is go from the abstract climate change to bringing it down to the concrete, the everyday, like on the ground level. So you can see that represented by a flower. It allows you to actually give names to things in your real life. So for climate change, for example, we can move to the why question. So why climate change? And for example, I could say global warming, and then why global warming? And then you could say greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions. And then you keep going down and further down. And so why CO2 emissions? And you can pin that to, let's say, a lot of cars on the road. And then you ask another why are there a lot of cars on the road? Transportation. And then why transportation? People have to get X from point A to point B for work. Why? And then it goes into this long list, and then that actually will build out a lot of your concept map by going the why, the why, the why. But you can also go from concrete to the how, and build back up to climate change. So these are questions you can ask in a daily conversation, if you're looking to see what people understand about climate change, and where are the touch points in which you can kind of integrate and begin to have a conversation. This also allows us to identify our stakeholders. And by leveraging these thinking strategies for systems around climate change, we can work towards a more equitable way forward. So making sure that everybody's accounted for across the social, the economic, the political groups when we're thinking about it. This is unfortunately not all that easy if we're only thinking about it in really one subset, or as just climate change in its abstract form. But when we begin to ask these questions, why, we see these stakeholders come together. We identify these stakeholders in our communities, and we know kind of where we need to get started with the discussions and who we'll need. So this is going to get to the final slide before we go into the Q&A. I know there's a lot of information. This is definitely a crash course, so feel free to rewind on the recording at some parts, and I'll be happy to share the slide deck. But really what we're talking about in next steps are beginning to bring these gears together, looking at these intersections of the individual biography, those memories that make us more in that eco side of the biosphere, being part of it instead of being separated from it, and looking how these gears interact. So putting climate change in conjunction with our individual biographies. What this does for us is allows us to focus on regeneration, or bringing some part of Earth or some part of the human life that we've already kind of established through the literature needs to change back into alignment with the biosphere. It goes beyond just sustaining, and it addresses the process of healing. Responding to the climate crisis is going to have to be in a way that heals systemic injustices, rather than deepen them. So going back to that systems, making sure that everybody's accounted for when we move forward with the climate conversations, that we're including everybody in when we talk about climate in that discussion. Integration, so integrating the head and heart, and this is really the locus of where the scientific rigor, the moral clarity, the analysis, the empathy, the strategy, and our imaginations meet. So the different ways in which we can discuss climate, or we're showing it through the film, through writing, through whatever it might be, and really just opening up the climate conversation in ways that usually we don't talk about. And then listening. So if we're going to start talking about climate, we're also going to need to be sure to listen. So if we do find people are on different levels of that ladder in terms of their understanding, we have to address that we're all coming together here as climate learners, that we're all learning together, and be informed, but then also extend our mental models as much as we can. And often that's going to happen through learning from experiences, things that are that come along with understanding the instrumental learning, but also create that human component, that human dimension that is part of the broader system, not separated, to truly get to a place where we are talking about climate. So hopefully we'll see those numbers from the Yale communications go up over the years, but it's really getting that messaging out that the climate discussion can be a personal one. It doesn't need to just be facts, but something that brings us all together. So I'm gonna stop there and answer any questions you might have. I know, again, a lot of information, but I appreciate you for bearing with me. And here is also my contact information.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. All right. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box already. So I'll start with the sort of with the first one. Josh, how would you define climate? Isn't it defined over a long period of time? If that's the case, how might we be able to talk about climate change when we might not necessarily have the data that goes back, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years? I think we're getting better about that now, and we're piecing together the past, which is why paleoclimate is such an important part of climate change science. But that could be, somebody who wants to debunk the idea that and the truth of or the science might say that. So how might we perhaps talk about these things and the data and going back?
Sorry, just jotting down some notes to make sure I can answer the question fully there. That becomes actually another one of those complexities around our understanding of time. And that's something that we've been really trying to focus on. And the solution there has really become visualizations. So these different simulations that have been out there to allow us to witness that, because it does hover in that abstraction area where it's tough to think back, all right, what did this planet look like hundreds and hundreds of years ago? I think, and I might be able to follow up with the URL to it, but I know Google Earth just came out with a really popular simulation going way back in time to show the effect of the Anthropocene or our human activities on climate. And I think that's really going to be the direction that fills the gap, because there is that gap of understanding, because we can't visualize it, because so much of what we're talking about happens from experience. And now there's the attention there. So I always will, any climate conversation will want to be on the optimistic note. The attention is there. But I think it's going to become these creative strategies using these visualizations that will allow us to have that secondary experience of that time lapse that's so hard to actually conceptualize from just a cognitive level.
Right. And this sort of hits at that idea as well. So doesn't climate show hysteresis? In other words, effects of today don't show up instantly, but take multiple decades to show. Could that be leading a misattribution of blame? How do we know events in the 18th century or the 19th century don't show up in climate today? If current human activity had an effect, why don't we talk about human caused weather changes instead of anthropogenic climate change?
Okay, there's a lot to that question.
Yeah.
I'm writing some notes down as well.
Yeah.
So this is one that would actually be we definitely don't have time to do it, but this would be one that would be excellent to go up the ladders of abstraction and really look at the whys and the hows of this. There's a lot at play in that question. I'm actually might open it up in the Q&A just so I can make sure I read it for what it is. But really what we're looking at there is that, again, it goes back to that temporality of the human activity, but I think the question is really aiming at how do we know human activity had such an effect? And it's unfortunately difficult to get that type of information out there in public discourse, is what I've been finding. So oftentimes, if you were to want to engage with that information, I feel like unfortunately it heavily lives in academic journals. It heavily lives in a very advanced statistical analysis and projections, but we haven't really done an excellent job of getting that to the forefront. And it kind of goes back to that countdown clock. If we look at it like that, where the messaging is not necessarily one that is compatible with a lot of people's mental models. And I think that's really the learning curve here, is if we are going to take responsibility for the human activities, it comes with some consequences to our mental model. We have to understand that we aren't necessarily passively living on this planet, and that there is a cost for our way of existing on this planet. So it touches on so much depth, but I think one of the call to actions from your question is trying to make that information a little bit more comprehensive outside of the heavily dense academic journals. I'm sorry, there's a lot to that question. My email is in the next slide. Feel free to open up to follow up, and I'd be happy to continue that conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And for our other viewers, if you do have questions, feel free to jump in as well using the Q&A box. This is one that I hear a lot, or I read a lot in different articles, kind of what is the big deal about climate change in this moment and now, and why does it seem sort of more urgent now? Climate is always changing. It's a natural process. And as humans, we should be adapting to it. So evolution, adaptation have made us, ready and prepared to adapt to change, or to adapt to changing climate. So how do we answer this particular question?
Yeah, the why now is something that I'm going to probably tap into the disaster preparedness side of my day-to-day tasks and understanding of climate. We've seen, and you can find this data from NOAA, for example, of the rise of billion-dollar disasters. I would say, and I think this question would really depend the why now. It's such an excellent question. Would depend on the lens of the researcher you're speaking to, and mine would probably be in disasters. And I'd say the why now is because we see just the magnitude and the frequency of these disasters occurring with extreme impacts on our society. And we spend a lot of time talking about what's the difference between the direct impacts, the indirect impacts, and multipliers after like a hurricane or a tornado. And what we're seeing now is that those indirect impacts, those times to recover, are prolonged in so many ways that it's hard to ignore the climate crisis. And I think it did take a long time to get that messaging out there, that the climate crisis is linked to disasters, for example. And even in the disasters community, they're moving away from even referring to them as natural disasters and referring to them as climatological disasters. But it's uprooted so many people's lives that they're paying attention. I know the Earth Institute, this summer we'll have a conference on managed retreat, which is just another one of those just key action items of the why now and the urgency. I think the messaging on urgency has definitely played a role into the why are we taking this so seriously now? Why are we acting now? Because even reflecting on it now, I think I saw something that this is the 51st annual climate week or Earth Day coming up. So we've been having these conversations for decades. But the why now, I think it's gotten to the point where it's going to be hard to ignore. So it's come really to that forefront of our theater of knowing, because you're seeing it with much more frequency. We have a better understanding of it as well, and I think the communication is improving. Yeah, so that's a tough question, but that why now, firsthand, just experiencing around the country with some of the work that we do at NCDP, is people are paying attention. They're really paying attention, and they want solutions, and we're working to make up for some lost time.
Yeah, I think that's, students kind of ask that a lot as well, and we get that in classrooms. And I think, there's certain thresholds that we've passed, and I think that contributes to the urgency question. And yes, there are still many natural processes that are happening as part of our changing climate. There's natural, and then there's, you see graphs and data of, here's where we would be if things were truly natural, and here's where the sort of human induced parts are. So it's also been a really fascinating learning process for someone who hasn't studied science. So this is really helpful, and these are really great questions, and tough questions, but really important questions to ask, especially if we want to better communicate and have some impact about perhaps reversing or adapting or truly adapting to those changes. We have a comment and question here about how climate change sadly does not affect everyone the same. So communities who do not contribute so much to global emissions, for example, have seen changes in their everyday lives and perhaps are more impacted heavily and in a very disproportionate way as a result of climate change. So how might we give stronger voices to those communities? And such a great question as well.
These are all really great questions. I wish we had more time to really pick these apart. That is something that we've constantly grappling with on the education side, because what we do know is that firsthand experience is a lot more powerful than the vicarious experience. So oftentimes when we talk about how people learn about climate, we have to say those who are fortunate enough not to have experienced a climatological disaster, because for them, they are trying to conceptualize that. Whereas with groups that they've survived hurricane seasons, they know immediately kind of what we're dealing with, what we're grappling with. So I think we've seen pretty novel ways in trying to get the communication out there, and it's coming through, ironically, more of the communicative learning, and coming through more of the different outlets that you wouldn't like historically put with climate science. But to your really important point of just the disproportion and how to give voices to people that we might unfortunately be overlooking, or their voice doesn't go up to the front of the newsfeed. I think what we're seeing in terms of the different forms, so you see it through art, you see it through poetry. I think we're really getting along with that notion that anybody can be included in a climate conversation, that anyone can be discussed, but amplifying those voices comes with its own challenges. That's something I would love to see kind of our work in a place like Columbia and a place like the Earth Institute to really address. And I'm sure there's researchers that are working on that, but amplifying those voices is important. But we also have to open up access to get engaged with the climate conversations. And I think a little bit of what we talked about today, focusing on really the individual biographies there and truly understanding their experience is going to be one way to do that. Also, last point to that, it would be the language barriers. I think there's some things that we've seen where specifically different communities that you'd want to work with, and you might not have materials in their native language. I think that's another excellent area in which we can begin to focus on.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm going to throw in one last question here, maybe part of one last question, because there's multiple questions here. So there's a comment about I love the individual biography and personal agency emphasis as part of these conversations. Do you think there's a major obstruction, or do you think a major obstruction is trying to centralize and present a top-down policy solution, or top-down policy solutions from at the federal government level, or say global institutions that are very much comprised of sort of privileged individuals? How might we better, I think, how might we be able to better balance those sort of top-down big idea policies, and then the personal agency and our individual roles in all of this?
Yeah, excellent question. And I'm going to try to do it justice. Does everyone want to co-author a dissertation? Because you guys are asking amazing questions.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. So I think the other thing that if we had more time to talk about systems specifically, when you talk about systems thinking, you can take either approach, like a top-down understanding the system, or bottom up. And what we're seeing with the policy and a lot of the major questions are turning attention to this transition period in terms of going to like more, one example that comes immediately to mind is green jobs. So making sure that when we're addressing green jobs to renewable energy sources, that it is including folks, that we're looking at the demographic data, and that it is not necessarily privileging just the privileged. But what we all experience in terms of trying to understand this as a system is that that there's a reason that political and economic circle is in that triad of social, political, and economic. And the slide's a little deceptive in the sense that, wait, let me go here real quick, that each of these circles are the same size. Realistically, we know these are not the same size, and that there's going to be a pull on each. Going back to one of the earlier questions around why now, why is the attention there, is I think there has opened up an economic opportunity that has also driven a lot of the attention now that's going towards the climate crisis. In addition to that, you have the political, just really close political alignment to economics. So for that reason, I would agree in kind of what the question was alluding to, is that we will see more of the top down. But in what we can do with these conversations, I think one of the things that we almost need to do immediately is make sure that we're having these conversations in schools, that we're having more of these social conversations, focusing on the social circle here, because really who's driving this direction at this point is going to be the economic and political circles. We have to make up with so we're not only just making up for lost time in terms of how we're using energy and the future here, but we're also making up a lot of lost time for the social elements of this. So how can we give people learning opportunities? I focus a lot on adult education, so working with people that have already gone through K through 12 and higher education and working with them. And that goes back to the mental models. Sometimes our mental models become so stringent on what we maybe grew up knowing, and when we try to induce new information into it, it becomes a little bit tougher to learn. So I would say to that, there's still hope to be participants in this, but right now it's going to take a lot more investment in time and in learning into this social circle. A lot of work to be done there, but I think we're starting, especially with like the K through 12 EI live series or something like that, is even just making this and opening up this conversation as a step.
Great, thank you. Yeah, very, very great questions. Very tough questions, but like I said, very important questions. So we'll get Josh to share the slide deck after. If you do have additional questions, feel free to reach out to him. His email is right here. We've gone a bit over time, so I want to be very respectful of everyone's time here. Josh, thank you again for your time. We'll be sharing this recording later this week. And as always, we'll put it up on YouTube. And so if you do want to come back to this afterwards, we can definitely make that happen. So as I mentioned, we have a special session on Thursday for Earth Day, and geared towards a slightly younger audience, but a very fun topic of what our scientists eat when they travel to faraway places for field work, and with limited resources, what do they do? And as I said, we'll have these until the end of June. So if you want to tune in for future sessions, please do so. And we are really excited that you're continuing to tune in for this. So Josh, thank you so much again for your time. And to our viewers, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you at a future session. All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks everybody.